Picture this. A teenage girl lies in bed at midnight, phone 3 inches from her face. Every reel on her For You page shows the same kind of face. Slim nose, full lips, high cheekbones, poreless skin. She flips to the front camera and starts trying filters like she's trying on faces. Each one takes her a bit closer to the algorithmic ideal and a bit further away from the one in the bathroom mirror. One day, she catches her reflection without a filter and thinks quietly, "This looks wrong." In another part of the world, a woman walks into a pharmacy and asks in a whisper for the stronger skin lightening cream. The package promises radiance, confidence, and success. What it doesn't mention are the burns, the mercury, or the way colonial histories live in a jar in the skincare aisle. On someone else's screen, an influencer posts a What I Eat on Ozempic blog. The comments call her disciplined, inspiring, finally taking control. That word, discipline, appears again and again, as if weight loss were a moral achievement and as if bodies can be sorted neatly into before and after, failure and success. And then a clip of Jamila Jamil goes viral. She says very calmly, "I just can't imagine mutilating myself for a bunch of pedophiles." And suddenly, everyone has an opinion on cosmetic surgery, patriarchy, and who gets to call what choice. Different stories, different bodies, same question. Who is telling the story of what a good body looks like? And what happens to us when we start to believe it? You're listening to The Social Mosaic, a podcast where we examine the patterns of power, identity, and justice that shape our world and imagine how to weave something better together. My name is Anna, and I am your host. I approach these conversations from an intersectional feminist lens, grounded in social work practice and theory. In the last episode, we explore emotional labor in what I called a kind of everyday dystopia. The way we are constantly performing, constantly managing our feelings for institutions, employers, algorithms. Today, I want to look at something underneath that performance. Narrative power, the stories that quietly tell us what our bodies should look like, how they should age, how they should move through the world. We are going to talk about beauty standards, cosmetic procedures, body image, but not in a 10 tips for body positivity way. I'm not going to give you a checklist of what to do. I actually don't think there is a neat set of answers here. What I do want is to sit in the discomfort a bit, to ask, how are these standards produced? Who benefits, and why does someone like Jamila Jamil feel driven to use language as strong as mutilating myself for a bunch of pedophiles? So take a breath, notice your own body in this moment, however it is, however it feels. Let's step into the stories that are shaping how we see it. Let's go back to that teenage girl scrolling through filters. We often talk about beauty standards as if they are just cultural or personal taste, as if they float around in some vague way and we are just pick what we like. But increasingly, they are engineered. They are outputs of systems. When a girl opens her For You page and sees the same face over and over again, that's not an accident. That's platforms learning through billions of data points which images keep our attention, which one gets likes and shares, and then feeding those images back to us until they start to feel like reality. Thin nose, full lips, high cheekbones, clear, light or lightly tanned skin, no wrinkles, no pores, no visible disability, no age. Instagram face isn't any one person. It is a composite, an algorithmically optimized mashup of features that have been coded as desirable in a particular racial, gender, and capitalist context. And then something strange happens. Your own face starts to feel wrong. Your unfiltered selfie feels like the before picture in someone else's after. This is one way narrative power works. It doesn't just say, here's what's pretty. It quietly rewrites what counts as normal. Michel Foucault would say power here is productive. It's not just forbidding things, it's producing norms. It's creating an idea of the right kind of body, the right kind of face. And we internalize that so that when we look in the mirror, we're seeing ourselves through that lens. On social media, power works through algorithms, filters, engagement metrics. The platform doesn't have to tell you this is the correct face. It just has to show you that face enough times that your brain starts to treat it as the baseline. And then there's the question of skin, because these aren't just neutral preferences for symmetry or clear skin. There is a whole history of colorism and colonialism sitting underneath them. Think about skin lightening creams. In many post-colonial societies, lighter skin is still associated with higher status, beauty, and success. That's not some natural preference, it's the legacy of centuries of being told that to be closer to whiteness is to be closer to power. Colonialism didn't just rearrange borders, it ranked bodies. It decided which skin tones were civilized, professional, pure, and which were not. That hierarchy didn't disappear when independence was declared or when segregation laws were repealed. It tricks around in who gets cast in ads, whose faces are on billboards, who gets hired for front desk versus the back office, whose selfies the algorithm quietly pushes to more people. So when a woman whispers for the strongest lighting cream, she's not simply being vain or self-hating. She's navigating a world where darker skin has been systematically devalued and where lighter skin still opens doors. At the same time, beauty standards don't just devalue blackness and brownness, they also steal from them. They appropriate. Let's make this concrete. For decades, black women were mocked for having full lips. Too big, too vulgar, too sexual. White beauty norms celebrated thin lips. Then suddenly, lip fillers became mainstream. Celebrities like Kylie Jenner helped popularize that look. Full lips became a global trend. The body part didn't change. The person wearing it did. When full lips are attached to a black woman, they're stigmatized and often hypersexualized. When they are attached to a white or racially ambiguous Instagram face, they are desirable and profitable. The same thing happens with curvy bodies. Black women, especially, have long been exoticized and shamed for having bigger hips, larger buttocks. And that history is not abstract, it has names and dates. I want to pause on one story in particular because it captures narrative power in a very stark way. It's the story of Sarah Bartman. You might have heard her referred to in racial colonial language as the Hottentot Venus. Most people haven't heard her real name. That in itself tells you something. Sarah Bartman was a Khoi woman from what is now South Africa, born in the late 18th century under brutal colonial conditions. As a young woman, she was taken, coerced, tricked, we'll never know the exact mix, to Europe. First to London, then to Paris. There, she was displayed in freak shows. Stripped down, sometimes in tight, flesh-colored garment, sometimes almost naked, made to stand on platforms while crowds of white Europeans stared, laughed, poked, prodded. Posters advertised her as a spectacle. Her buttocks, her labia, Her difference from white women was the selling point. Doctors and quote-unquote scientists came to examine her, measure her, draw her. They used her body as evidence that African women were hypersexual, closer to animals, less evolved. These weren't fringe figures. They were respected in their time. Her humiliation was part of how European science built its authority. She died in her mid-20s in poverty. And even in death, Sara was not left alone. Her body was dissected, her skeleton and genitals preserved in jars, displayed in the Paris Museum well into the 20th century. Her remains were only returned to South Africa and buried with ceremony in 2002. Why am I telling you this grim history in an episode about beauty? Because Sarah Bartman's story is a very literal example of narrative power deciding what a body means. Her body, her curves, her flesh wasn't neutral. Under colonial eye, it became a story. The story that African women's bodies are excessive, grotesque, available for scrutiny and use. That story justified all kinds of violence, sexual exploitation, medical experimentation, the denial of black women's femininity and humanity. Now, fast forward 200 years. We live in a world where the same body type, large buttocks, small waist, is sold back to us as the ideal, but on a very particular kind of woman, usually white or light-skinned or racially ambiguous. That shape on Sarah was a freak show. That shape on Kim Kardashian is a brand. The story has flipped, but only for some people. On black women, curves are still policed and fetishized. Black girls get sent home from school for dress code violations that have more to do with their bodies than with their clothes. They are adultified, seen as older, more sexual, less innocent than white girls their age. That Sarah story is still echoing. On white women, similar curves are hourglass goals. They sell fitness programs, shapewear, surgery packages. You can see the ghost of the freak show in every before and after BBL ad. In both cases, the body is being used, but who gets dignity, who gets money, and who gets mocked are very different. Sarah Bartman's life also shows how institutions, theaters, medical schools, museums work together to fix a narrative. Entertainment, science, and culture all collaborated to say, this is what black womanhood is. That's narrative power at a structural level. Once you see that, it's hard not to notice the modern versions. The influencer who gets viral for her natural curves, carefully photographed and monetized. The plastic surgeon's greed of perfect bodies. The algorithm boosting one kind of curvy body while keeping another shadow band. These are not random. They are part of a long lineage of deciding which bodies exist for others' gaze and which gets to be owned by the person living in them. So when we talk about beauty standards, we are really talking about control over meaning. Who gets to say what a big butt signifies? Who gets to say what full lips signify? Who gets to say what dark skin signifies? For Sarah, those meanings were imposed violently from the outside. Today, we are told we are choosing them, but the script is still heavily written in advance. Narrative power is not just about positive or negative representation. It's about whose stories about our bodies become the default. Medical stories, marketing stories, pornographic stories, colonial stories. What happens to our own stories in that mix? Let's move from faces and history to what we actually do to our bodies in response. Think of that Ozempic influencer we talked about in the beginning. She's documenting her weight loss, weekly injections, shrinking measurements, maybe some nausea, maybe some hair loss. The comments are full of praise. You're so disciplined, finally taking control, hard work. Notice the language. Discipline, control, hard work. Thinness isn't just an aesthetic here, it's a moral narrative. A quote unquote good woman is someone who is constantly managing herself, not eating too much, not taking up too much space, not being too anything. Foucault would call this self-surveillance. You internalize the gaze so deeply that you do not need anyone to shout at you. You weigh your food, track your steps, punish yourself at the gym. And if you're not doing those things, you're told you should be. Rosalind Gill talks about this as the makeover paradigm. The idea that you're never quite good enough as you are, but you can fix yourself through products, through lifestyle, through sheer willpower. There is always another serum, another diet, another tweak. In the last decade, the makeover paradigm has blended with confidence culture. The pressure now is not just to transform your body, but to feel empowered while doing it. To say, I'm just doing this for me, even when the standard you're chasing is clearly external. And that's where Jamila Jamil comes in. If you've seen the interview I'm talking about, you'll know she doesn't mince words. She sits there and says something like, look, for years I mutilated myself for patriarchy. She talks about extreme dieting, over-exercise, disordered eating, constantly tweaking and punishing herself to fit this idea of what a woman is supposed to look like. She's very explicit about how much harm she did to herself, starving herself, abusing her body, taking dangerous shortcuts, and how that harm was praised. She was called dedicated, disciplined, so strong. She was rewarded for being willing to hurt herself to fit the ideal. And then she looks at where we are now, where Botox and fillers and surgery are marketed as self-care and empowerment. And she says, hang on, when we describe cosmetic surgery as just pro-choice and leave it there, we ignore the context that produces those choices. Her line about not being able to imagine mutilating myself for a bunch of pedophiles is harsh. It's meant to be. What she's pointing out is this. Who originally set these standards? Who decides that women need to look forever young, hairless, poreless, tiny? Who benefits from a woman being desperate to appear like teenagers well into their 40s and 50s? Who profits from us believing that we should go under the knife or inject ourselves with things we do not fully understand to meet that standard? She says essentially, we have been taught to do unpaid, often painful labor on our bodies to keep ourselves palatable for the gaze we did not choose. And then we are sold that labor back as empowerment. She also talks about the money. Facelifts can cost as much as a car. Fillers and Botox requires constant top-ups. Diet drugs are expensive. All of this in a world where women are already earning less, paying more for feminine products, and often spending extra money just to be safe, on taxis instead of walking at night, on self-defense classes, on security. So you're paid less, taxed more, and it's more expensive to simply exist safely. And then there's this massive industry saying, you should really save up for surgery though, for your self-esteem, for your career, for your relationship, for your Instagram. She calls it simping for the patriarchy and paying money to do it. It's a brutal line, but it captures something important. We are not just suffering under these standards, we are also funding them. And again, this isn't about judging individuals who choose surgery or Botox or weight loss drugs. I'm not sitting here saying, if you're done those things, you're duped or you're wrong. We all make the choices we can in the conditions we're living. Some people need certain interventions for gender affirmation, for safety, for survival. The point Jamila is making, and the point I find compelling, is that we cannot talk about these choices as if they float in a vacuum. The menu itself is politically shaped. The fact that I hate my nose, or I hate my wrinkles, or I hate my fat is such a common sentence is not a coincidence. Bell Hooks once wrote that a lot of what gets called freedom in a patriarchal culture is really just freedom to consume, freedom to buy more, to tweak more, to self-optimize more. And she asks, where is the collective conversation? Where is the question of the systems that keeps us in a state of perpetuate self-critique in the first place? The discomfort, for me, is sitting right there. How do you hold respect for people's bodily autonomy and also be honest about the fact that patriarchy is constantly whispering in our ears, you're not enough, but you could be if you just... I don't have a neat answer. I don't think Jamila does either. What she offers is anger. She's angry at an industry that convinced her to hurt herself and then rebranded the harm as empowerment. She's angry at how quickly we've normalized some really extreme interventions, like major surgery or lifelong injections, as casual, almost routine. And honestly, I think that anger is appropriate. So far, we've looked mostly at the dominant scripts, the Instagram phase, the Ozempic discipline story, the cosmetic surgery as a self-care story. Let's zoom out a bit, because people have never just quietly accepted these standards. There's been resistance for as long as there's been rules. Think about fat liberation. Not the watered down, love your curves marketing version, but the original political movement that said, the problem isn't my body, the problem is a fatphobic, capitalist, racist system that punishes certain bodies and rewards others. Or think about disability activists rejecting the idea that a good body is one that hides all the traces of pain, difference, or impairment, that pushes for access, for mobility aid, for visible difference, is a direct challenge to the aesthetic of smooth, effortless, perfect bodies. Or queer and trans communities playing with gender presentation, mixing signals, refusing neat categories, refusing to make themselves legible to the straight gaze. Ballroom culture, for instance, has been doing this for decades. If you ever watched Paris is Burning or Pose, you've seen people creating whole new categories of beauty and glamour that have nothing to do with respectability politics. All these are, in a sense, stories about bodies that say, we will not contort ourselves to fit your scripts. We're going to write our own. Sara Ahmed's feminist killjoy shows up here too. In the first episode, we talked about the killjoy as the person who refuses to laugh at the sexist joke, who points out the racism in the room. In the context of bodies, the killjoy is the fat friend who says, can we please stop talking about diets at this table? Or the colleague who says that you've looked so skinny comment is not a compliment. Or the older woman who refuses to dye her gray hair and is very clear that it's not a sign of letting herself go. These people spoil the happiness that's supposed to come from conforming. They disrupt the pleasure some people get from collectively hating their bodies, from bonding over self-loathing. But resistance is complicated too. We've all seen how quickly movements get co-opted. Body positivity started as a radical space for fat and marginalized bodies. Now, it's often represented by relatively small, relatively conventional bodies, posting carefully curated imperfection for likes. Brands love the language of self-love as long as you're still buying their products. Diversity campaigns plus a plus-size model here, a hijabi model there, a disabled model there, and nothing changes about who owns the company, who works in the factories, and who is still getting policed for their bodies in everyday life. So, representation matters, but it's not the whole story. Visibility isn't the same as safety or freedom or justice. And again, I don't have neat solutions here. I don't know how we stop every movement from being turned into an aesthetic. I don't know how we stop the algorithm from rewarding things that fit a certain visual formula. What I do know is that it's worth paying attention to how quickly resistance gets turned into content. How a movement that started by saying, I refuse to make my body palatable for you, ends up being used to sell leggings. It's also worth paying attention to who gets to be the face of liberated narratives. Who ends up on the magazine cover for ageless beauty? Whose wrinkles are graceful and whose are letting yourself go? Who gets to be the edgy, racially ambiguous, curvy influencer, and who is still being stopped and searched or denied jobs or assaulted for having the same features? These are uncomfortable questions. They do not come with a how-to guide. But I think sitting with them is part of staying honest. I could, at this point, pivot into advice. I could say, here are 3 things you can do to resist beauty standards, or here's how to fix your feed. But if I'm honest, that feels a bit dishonest. We're up against big structural forces here. Global industries, social media companies, histories of racism and patriarchy that run deep. There are things we can do, of course, individually, collectively, but none of them are magic. None of them guarantee that we will suddenly wake up and love every millimeter of our bodies, or that the world will treat all bodies with respect. So, instead of answers, I just want to leave you with a few open questions. When you feel that urge to fix something about your body, whether it's as small as editing a photo or as big as surgery, can you get curious, just for a second, about where that urge is coming from? What stories are running in the back? When you find yourself judging someone else's body, an influencer, a stranger on the street, a friend, your own child, whose voice is that? Is it actually yours, or is it something you absorbed long before you had a say? And when you hear people like Jamila Jamil use language as strong as mutilating myself for a bunch of pedophiles, does that spark anger, defense, relief, maybe all 3? None of those reactions are wrong. They're just information. They tell us how entangled we are, how much our sense of self is knotted up with these big, ugly, complicated systems. You do not have to untangle it all today. I certainly would not. But paying attention to the stories, that feels like a start. Next time, we're widening the frame, still thinking about bodies and power, but from a different angle. I'll be in a conversation with Professor Bernard Mayaka, one of the editors of the Ubuntu Practitioner and co-author of a really important piece on Ubuntu and social work. Ubuntu is often translated as I am because we are. You've heard me mention it in the care episode, but what does that actually mean in practice? We are going to talk about Ubuntu as philosophy and practice, how it challenges Western ideas of the isolated individual, how it reframes concepts like self-determination into co-determination, and what it would mean for social workers, activists, and communities to treat interdependence as a strength instead of a weakness. We'll also talk about decolonizing social work. We'll ask whether Ubuntu can survive in systems built on competition and individualism, or whether it pushes us to imagine something beyond capitalism altogether. If you ever felt the tension between the humanity you want to bring to your work and the systems you're operating in, this next episode is for you. Until then, notice the stories you're being told about bodies. Notice the stories you tell. You do not have to have it all figured out. Before you go, I'd really love to hear from you. If this episode stirred something, anger, relief, discomfort, drop a comment wherever you're listening and tell me what stories shape how you see your own body. What narratives are you unlearning or trying to? At the moment, episodes are being released once a month, and I'm also writing essays on the Substack of the Social Mosaic. If you found this useful, hit like, share it with a friend, and make sure you're subscribed or following so you do not miss the Ubuntu conversation and more to come. It helps more people stumble across this conversation, and it really does make a difference for an independent show like this. Until next time, I am Anna, and this is the Social Mosaic. Thank you for listening. Bye!